Hey y'all, so today I want to talk about HTML events and how they work inside Vue.js. And so I'm going to cover HTML events in case you're not familiar with them, as well as how to handle them within Vue, and then also some examples of how you can use them more practically in your application. So starting off, what are HTML events? So HTML events can be generally defined as things that happen to HTML elements. And I know this is kind of abstract, but it generally captures the idea of what we're going for. So here's some examples of different events that the browser has. And keep in mind, these are all really well documented by browsers, and so these are all shared standards by various browsers, right? It's things that are handled natively by the browser and not something that you have to actively generate as a developer. These events are generated by the browser, and all we're responsible for doing is handling them, right? So for example, there can be a click event, which is when you click on an HTML element, like say a button or a div, hover, which is hovering over the element, or even when the page is loaded or certain elements are loaded, right? And so these are all things that can happen to various elements. So looking at a simple example, we might have a button, and when you click the button, you want it to display a prompt to the user, say to log out. And so what that workflow would look like is when you click as a user, click the button, the browser, again, this is a browser's responsibility, would generate the click event. Then whoever developed this page, they would have to have defined this click handler. And a handler is just a function written in JavaScript that is, responsible for reacting to this event that happens. And so the handler is responsible for then doing the logic to open this prompt and making it available to the user. And so again, the flow is you click the button, the event is generated by the browser. The handler needs to be listening to this event and handling the event appropriately by taking action, whatever that action may be. And so the natural next question is, how does the handler really listen for the event? How does the handler know when this event is triggered? In plain JavaScript and HTML, we can define it in the syntax. For example, this is a button element, right? And we can say onClick equals with the quotation marks, and then inside these quotation marks, you just write some JavaScript. OnClick, what that means, as the name suggests, is whenever a click event happens, execute this JavaScript that is inside these quotation marks. And so we can see this JavaScript, what it would do is it calls the native JavaScript function alert, which basically just opens a very simple, ugly looking prompt on the browser. It just says with this text inside of it, log out. This should be a question mark. That's my bad. And so that's how you link the handler to the event for a specific element, right? For this button, we want to listen for this event, and every time this event happens, we want to use this JavaScript as the handler for that event. But as a simple next step, let's look at the Vue syntax for how you would define a handler for a specific event. And so in Vue, we use the syntax of the @ symbol, and it's essentially analogous to onClick or onHover, things like that, right? You just say @click, @hover, @keyup. And so keyup is when you press a key. It's the naming is very similar to just the plain JavaScript, and it operates in the same way. And so inside these quotation marks, you would just write a bit of JavaScript that would get executed every time this event happens. Keep in mind though, the reason why this is much more powerful in Vue is because we know that in Vue, you can define JavaScript functions of your own kind of in the bottom portion of the file, right? Especially if you're using the single file component structure. And on the top part's the HTML. Underneath it, there's like some JavaScript that you can write. And you can define a lot of custom functions and then use those functions right here as a click handler or whatever event handler, right? So it's really easy to write some custom JavaScript logic and then link it into an HTML element. At this point, if you're still confused about HTML events, I would definitely recommend reading up on that more before proceeding to the next part of the video. You can find a lot of great documentation on this, and I'd recommend a website called MDN. If you just search up MDN on Google, you should find it. It's a site made by Mozilla that essentially contains a lot of tools and resources for web development, and it explains a lot of these concepts really clearly. So now I'm going to talk about another really important concept called event propagation or event bubbling. And so to do that, we're going to use a simple code snippet. It's just basically 3 divs nested within one another, 3 different sizes. Each one is smaller than the one above it, and they're just kind of nested within another like a Russian doll. And so you can see that each one has a click handler, and what the click handler does is it calls this function highlight div. And what that highlight div does is it just takes, uses ref, And so a reference is just like an easy way to find a particular element. It's a Vue functionality. And so it finds this particular div based on this ref name, and then it changes the style to red. And then after 1.5 seconds, we're going to change it back to white. All in all, what it does is basically you click on the div, it turns red for like a few seconds, and then it turns back to white. Simple enough. Now, looking at this page, you can see, as promised, 3 boxes, and when I click them, it should turn red. However, I want you to think about this question briefly before proceeding. If I click on this most inner box, what do you think should happen? I'm clicking inside this box, right? And it seems natural that this box should turn red. But what about the boxes behind it? If I click in this space, it's technically inside this box as well as inside this box as well, right? So who should really receive that click event? And should all of them turn red, or just one of them, or maybe the most back one or front one? Honestly, depends on perspective. You know, which box should be receiving the event? So just think about that for a few seconds. You can pause the video if you need. Okay, now I'm going to click on it and let's see what happens. So as you can see, all 3 boxes actually turn red. And why does that happen? And as you might have started to realize based on the name, HTML events, they don't just stop with one element. They actually get propagated or bubbled upwards. And so we call it bubbling or propagation because it continues beyond the first element. Like a bubble, it travels upwards to its parents all the way until it reaches the top or the surface, you know, the root of the page, just like a bubble inside water. And so when you click this box, the event doesn't just stop. It starts with this box, but it doesn't stop there. It continues to pass it on to its parents until it reaches the root of the page. So coming back to the code, essentially what that means is when I click on this div, it does start here and it triggers this click handler. However, it also passes that click event then to its parent. And this parent also has a click handler, so that will get triggered and it'll turn red. And then it's going to pass it up to its parent, and that's also going to get triggered. It happens all kind of simultaneously just because, you know, it happens so fast, you don't really see the difference in the timing one after the other. Essentially, that's what's happening. It's starting here, getting passed to its parent and to its parent. This one doesn't have a click handler, so this div doesn't do anything with the event. It just kind of passes it along. And so this may or may not be the behavior that you expected for this event to have. And so this can become problematic in situations where you want the event to actually only trigger one element. You want it to stay on this element that it was clicked. And so to solve those types of problems, we're going to need to go on to the next topic, which are event modifiers. Event modifiers are a specific feature of Vue, and they basically allow you to add certain attributes to an event handler. And so the way you do it is you use this dot notation, and these are some of the common modifiers, and you just do dot and then the name of the modifier. The first modifier I'm going to talk about is dot stop. So dot stop is essentially equivalent to the native JavaScript method called stop propagation, and you can read documentation for that again on MDN as well. As the name suggests, what it does is it just stops the event from being propagated or bubbled up to parent elements. Coming back to our code example, if we added a dot stop here, what this would mean is after this click event is captured and handled, it will just stop at this element. It won't pass that event up to its parents. And so if we save that and look at this, when we click this div, it'll capture the event and the handler will trigger for this element, but the event won't get passed on to parent elements. However, if we click this part, this element will still pass that event onto its parents, right? And so you can see that dot stop is really useful for kind of isolating and preventing the element from continuing upwards. Another common HTML modifier is .prevent, and this is synonymous with the JavaScript function .prevent default, which you can also find in the MDN documentations probably. And what this does is it prevents the default browser behavior for a particular event. Various HTML elements, they have default behaviors for different events. And the clearest example of this is the right click. So pretty much all HTML elements, the default behavior for a right click is to show this browser context menu, right? I think you've all seen this before. It has a bunch of like different features based on your browser, including the most popular inspect element. So this is the default behavior. But if you didn't want this menu to pop up, what you could do is do a .prevent on the right click event. And what that means is when you right click, this menu would not pop up. And we can try that on our site. And so right now you see if we right click this div, this menu will pop up. And let's go into the code and let's add another event handler, right? So we can add click.write By default, a click means left click, but if we specify .right, which is another modifier, we can specify the right click. And we can chain these modifiers together. So this is an example of that. We're going to say at click.right, so meaning the right click, .prevent. And what this means is that we want to prevent default behavior for the right click event. Notice how we don't specify anything on the right side like we normally might with handlers, right? So if we don't specify anything, it just means there's no handler. All we want to do is prevent the default behavior, but we don't want to replace it with anything else. But we could replace it with custom behavior, but for now, let's just leave it blank, right? So that's basically the same thing as this. And so if we come to the site and we try to right-click this div, you can't see me right-clicking, but I promise you I am. Let's do some mouse ASMR. And so you can hear I'm right-clicking. If I right-click this part, it pops up, but for this div, if I right-click, it doesn't do anything. And so an example of this in a real application is with Google Drive. A lot of you have probably done this before, but maybe not explicitly realized it. If you right-click an item in Google Drive, right, that browser menu doesn't pop up, but this specific Google Drive context menu will pop up. And so how they achieve this is essentially you have to first prevent the default browser behavior and then add your own custom behavior on the right-click handler. Same here. If you right-click, it just opens up these custom context menus and not the browser menu. So that's about it for this video, and once again, this is just a super brief introduction. We barely even scratched the surface of events and how you can use them. Events are super important for web development. They basically tie the HTML and JavaScript together, and every web developer will have to use events to create a robust web page. So make sure you stay tuned for future videos. I'm planning on making another video covering custom events in Vue and going into more detail on that. So be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content, and to support me personally in making these videos. And I really appreciate you all watching, and I'll see you next time.